Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. We'll share how a research-based approach to analytics can empower your forestry organization to make better decisions with your data. Welcome, everyone, to today's podcast. I really appreciate you joining. Today I want to talk about institutional investment in timberlands. Now, what's really spurred this is an excellent book I've recently read called From Backwoods to Boardrooms, The Rise of Institutional Investment in Timberland. And so this book was written by Dr. Dawei Zhang, who's at Auburn University. He's the George Peake Professor and Associate Dean in Research at the School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences. I was also intrigued by this topic because of a session I attended at the Society of American Foresters Convention. So it got me wanting to know more and digging in a little deeper into some of the data behind institutional investment and the rise in timberlands as an investment across especially the United States. And so the book really goes into a lot of history, which is what I really love about it. And it kind of talks going from the early 1900s onward about forests and ownership patterns. And so it talks obviously about how industrial timberlands were really the focus up to about 1980s. And then really since then, how a lot of the ownership and investment in timberlands has shifted to institutions. And so there's some economics in the book, although not a whole lot, or some equations, but there's a lot of history in it, which is what I really like, especially learning about how all of these different companies, whether they be timber investment management organizations or real estate investment trusts, and how they've really come to be, and a lot of the history and some of the conversations even behind many of these big changes in timberland ownership across the U.S. And so the book, I really love the book, and it got me, as I said, digging into the data a little bit more. And this is really what I made a recent blog post on, which I'll link to in the notes. Really looking for some data behind timberlands as investments. And so for those of you that subscribe to my newsletter, I put together a graph of the month every month where I try to find an interesting graph about forestry and data that I share as a part of my email newsletter. And so what I found here, as I was looking more at timberland investments and I was looking more into some of the data behind this, I also saw news about some of the metrics that are used that were recently posted for 2021. And so specifically, and Dr. Zhang talks about this in the book, a lot of different metrics that track the rise and fall of some of these timberland investment classes. And so as one example, the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries is a nonprofit that tracks a lot of institutional investments in just the rise and falls of many of these companies that, in our case, are in timberlands, but they also do metrics for other industries as well. And so just this past week, they posted their fourth quarter returns for what they call their Timberland Index. And so this Timberland Index represents over 400 investment-grade timberland properties with a market value of over $24 billion. And so a lot of properties are involved in this, and they've been tracking that for a number of years now. And if you look at how much it's grown, well, in the fourth quarter of 2021 alone, it's grown 4.5%, which is the largest single quarter return for the index since the fourth quarter of 2014. And so just an incredible explosion of growth in that index here in the last quarter in 2021. If you look at the whole year of 2021, the Timberland Index gained over 9%. And so that was the biggest gain since 2014. In 2014, the gain was about 10.5%. And so really interesting to know, of course, as people are more interested in owning timberlands as investments, as we're thinking about carbon markets, as we're thinking about other markets driven by ecosystem services, timberlands are being looked to as a place to invest. And so historically, obviously there's been a steady growth in demand for these timberland investment classes. We've always needed wood products. We've always needed raw materials, and wood being one of them. and this reason alone, kind of with the traditional, wood and forest products sector being an important part of this, but now with kind of the natural capital and the importance and the interest in investing in timberlands as impact investments. Timberlands are very attractive, and they can provide a hedge against inflation. I think if you look at a lot of the finance world and how they're suggesting timberlands be a part of one's portfolio, inflation is a big part of that, which is certainly something that a lot of people are thinking about here in 2022. And so what I found interesting too, oftentimes, and myself, I'm not a big time investor any means. I have some accounts that I toy with, but by no means am I trading on a daily basis. But what's interesting to look at is that if you look at the Timberland index, we can quantify how risky it is. And so we can compare that to other things, like a simple one being like the 10-year Treasury note. And so what's the return on that? How variable is that return? And another one, the S&P 500. So we can compare the Timberland index to that. And so what we see with the Timberland index is an average return in the last 12 years of 4.6%. And so if you compare that to the U.S. Treasury 10-year, that tracks the gross domestic product pretty closely. The 10-year Treasury return is about 2.2% over the last 12 years. The S&P 500, much greater. That's at 15.6% average return over the last 12 years. Now, if you look at the risk involved in some of those different metrics, what's interesting, the 10-year Treasury is a pretty low risk. It's low return, low risk. So the coefficient of variation, or the standard deviation of the returns over the last 12 years relative to the average return is about 32%. If you look at the S&P 500, the coefficient of variation of that return is about 75%, so higher reward, high risk. If you look at the Timberland index, what is interesting about the Timberland index is that the coefficient of variation of the return is about 83%. And so it's interesting to note that the risk for the Timberland index and the S&P 500 is about the same, 75 versus 83%. And obviously the return hasn't been as much for the Timberland index. But if you look at the last 12 years anyway, that return has been pretty consistent. Again, speaking to that steady growth and demand for wood and forest products. And so really interesting to highlight and to look at where timberlands are related to other investment classes. And so that was really what I highlighted here in the graph of the month as a part of the newsletter, was just looking at the average rates of returns over the last 12 years for some of these indices. Now, of course, the big thing is that timberlands as an investment have gained their biggest amount since 2014. And again, going back to just the incredible rise of, obviously, markets for lumber took pretty big swings in 2020 and then into last year in 2021. And so there's just an incredible demand for wood and forest products. And then, too, as we're kind of seeing the rise of environmental, social, and governance investing, or ESG investing, there's no doubt that there's a lot of interest in timberlands as an asset class looking into the future. And so these can certainly be attractive to folks that are seeking to not only diversify their portfolio, but also to lean more into the ESG momentum, a place where lots of people are focusing a lot of investments now. And so these reasons, I'll post the link to the graph and the post in the notes. But these reasons are excellent ones to be thinking about timberlands as investments and just speak to the incredible rise of timberlands as an asset class. Again, that book is an excellent one, From Backwoods to Boardrooms. I really encourage anyone that has any interest in understanding some of the markets behind timberlands, some of the ownership, and especially the history of these timberland asset classes. There's an incredible amount of information in that book that I highly recommend. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com. timberlands.com.